WTF GPT. What's up, everyone? My name is Dan Vega, and today we are building a Java CLI that talks to OpenAI's API, the same API that is behind Chat GPT. Now, at this point, I'm sure I don't need to introduce you to what Chat GPT is or how it works or how it's kind of revolutionizing the industry. We'll leave that for another video or another time. Today, what I want to do, though, is go through this together and build an application that we can then create a native executable out of using GraalVM so that we can use this from the command line. I envision a time where I'm on a command line and I want to go WTF GPT. What is the command to run a Spring Boot application using Maven? And I get the answer back. So that's kind of the process, the thought process behind this video. It's one, being able to use the OpenAI API, but two, I think it's a pretty practical example that we can all get some use out of. So I'm really excited to do this. But before we jump in, there is something we need to do. We're going to head over to the OpenAI's API documentation. You'll want to read through here. I've kind of went through this already. I've kind of understand some of the concepts, the different APIs that are available. The API that we're working with today is the completion. So given a prompt, the model will return one or more predicted completions and can also return the probabilities of alternative tokens at each position. So this is the API that we're working with. To work with this, you're going to need an API key. To do so, you're going to go up, create an account, and then in your account, you can go to View API Keys. You're going to create a new secret. So once this key is generated, you can go ahead and copy this, and this is the API key that you're going to need. I'm going to use this one, but this will go ahead and get deleted after this video has been created. But feel free to generate your own API key, and that will be enough to get started. So what are we waiting for? Let's head over and write some code. All right, to get started, we're using IntelliJ. You can use whatever IDE or text editor you like in IntelliJ to create a new project. I went to the new project wizard, and we are creating just a new project here. We're going to name this WTF GPT, and I'm going to place this in my downloads folder. This is going to be a Java project. I'm using the Maven build system. We are going to be using JDK GraalVM 17. This is a very specific version, so you want to check that out. We're using 22.0.3. I think it doesn't matter because this is just a normal Java project. But if you want to build the native executable at the end of this, you'll want to be on GraalVM. If not, just choose whatever JDK installation you have. So I'm going to go ahead and change the group ID to dev.danvega, and that is the artifact. So we'll go ahead and click create. And after a few moments, we are brought here into IntelliJ, and we basically have a simple Maven project. So we have a couple properties in here. We're targeting Java 17, so that's what these two do. And there's really no other source code in here. So we have a source main Java and a source main resources. No default package in here, so you'll want to go ahead and create that. So mine is dev.danvega, and that should get us going. Now, before we write any code, what I want to do is kind of test out the API so we could see what the request and the response sort of looks like. You could do this in whatever client tool you like to use. Maybe it's Postman, maybe it's straight from the command line. Here in IntelliJ, we can use the HTTP client. And I can go ahead and create a new file for this. And what's nice about this is something that will get checked into the repository, which, as always, you can find in the description below. So if you're interested in the final source code, check that out. But what will be in the final repository is this gpt.http. So this is a file that you can produce a bunch of HTTP tests on. So what I want to do is test out the API that we're going to be working with. So this is a post request to https api.openai.com/v1/completions. So the content type for this is going to be application/JSON, and then you need to pass in an authorization header. That authorization header is a bear, and then you need to paste in your secret key. That's the one we talked about at the beginning of this video. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. Again, this will be gone at the end of this video, so don't use mine. and then we can go ahead and pass in some data. So I'm going to go ahead and copy some stuff in here. This is what a sample request looks like. Again, this is going back to the documentation. If you have a chance to look through the documentation, this should look pretty familiar. What is the model we're using? This is the model. What is the prompt? That's the question we're asking. We're saying, hey, what is the command to list all the files in a directory on Mac OS? The answer to that would, of course, be ls. Then there's a way to kind of set tweak some settings here. That is using the temperature and the max tokens. So that is what a sample request looks like. So now with that, I can actually perform a sample post request to this API and get back something. So let's see what this looks like. And we see that, let's go back up here. So we have a 200. It looks like everything went through okay. We have our... If you look here, we have our authorization in there, so that is good. And what we get back is a bunch of choices, and in this case, it's only one choice, and the text is ls. So we have some new line characters, and then the answer is basically ls. So this is what the response looks like, though, and this is what we want to pay attention to. So this is... So we have like an ID object, created, model, and then we have an array of choices. Those choices have things like text index, log probes, finish reasons, and then there's a usage that shows our prompt tokens, completion tokens, and total tokens. Now for this tutorial, we probably only need something like the choices and the text. But what I want to do is actually build out the models or the objects that kind of represent this response. Just so we can get in the practice of doing that. But at the end of the day, when we send a request, this is the response that we're going to get back, and we need to handle that. All right, so I'm going to get started here by creating a new Java class. We're going to call this WTF GPT. And inside of here, we are going to have a public static void main, and this is going to be the entry point to our application. So what I want to do is create a new scanner, and this will allow us to take in system.in. So I'm going to say system.in, we'll create a var for that, and we'll call that scanner. Once I have a scanner, I'm going to do a quick system out, and I'm going to say enter a string to search for. So this is going to be our prompt for the user. Once we have a prompt, I'm going to say search string is equal to scanner.next line. So that is us prompting for a search string and reading it in through the console. Next, I need to get an input together. So this is going to be my input. I am on Java 17, so I could take advantage of text blocks here. So I'm going to use this text block to go ahead and create a request. So this request is going to look pretty similar to the one we did over here, right? So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to paste this in here, and let's get that back. Okay, that's fine. The only difference is the prompt is going to be, we'll use a token here, and then what I'll say is I will, so temperature 1, tokens 100, that's right. So then I'm also going to say formatted search string. So now what I can do is once I have that, I have a string, an input that I can go ahead and pass in a request. So now what I need to do in Java is create a request to some API. The way that I'm going to do that, and there are many different ways you can do this depending on what version of Java you're in, depending on if you want to bring in some external libraries. I'm going to just use Java. In Java 11, we got something called an HTTP client, and this was an addition. This was a really nice API to work with calling APIs. So what I want to do is I want to say HTTP request. We'll say new builder. And what we're going to do is kind of build out a request, and it starts with the URI. So the URI is going to be that string. Oops, so I got to say URI.create. And then this is going to be that URL that we used before. So api.openai.com/v1/completions. All right. So now that I have the URI, I want to pass in a couple headers. One is going to be content type, and that is going to be application/JSON. And then the next header is going to be that authorization. So authorization. And this is going to be bearer and then the token or the secret key that we copied from before. So I'm going to come back over here and grab that from here. So that's this key. And there that is. So as you can see, we're kind of creating that similar request that we did a test on using the HTTP client, but now in code. Finally, this is going to be a post request. And all we're going to do here is say HTTP request.body publishers of, and then we're going to, of string. And so now we're going to basically take that input that we created above and use that as the body. So once we have that, we can go ahead and build this, and that is what we need. So I am going to create a var from this. We'll call this a request, and that is our request. So cool. So what we've done so far is ask the user for input. We've read that in from the command line. We've created a request object. This is really just a JSON object that includes those things that the API needs. Once we have that, we are going to, and we're basically inserting the search string here for whatever this token is here. So now we have our input. We're creating a request using the HTTP client in Java 11, passing in our headers. This is a post, and we're building this object. So now we have a request object. To use that request object, we need a client. So we're going to say HTTP client.new HTTP client. And let's go ahead and create a var out of this. So we'll call this client. And once I have a client, I'm going to go ahead and create a response. And we'll just say client.send. And we're going to send the request that we created above. And what is going to be the response body handler? That is going to be HTTP response.body handlers.of string, and that should be it. So now I got a response back. I should be able to output the status code. Response. Oh, did I not spell that right? That would help. Response.status code, right? So that's one. The other is the response.body. Let's create a var, dot out for that. So now I'm just basically outputting the status code and the response that we get from the OpenAI API. We're going to add a couple exceptions here. Actually, I think just one. Yeah, so an IO and an interrupted exception. And that should be it to get started. So this is going to be kind of V1. We're going to make this work. We're going to improve on this as we go, right? So let's see if we can go ahead and run this. And it's asking for a search string. What is the Docker command to list all images? And cool, so I got a 200 response, and then here's the response. And you can see that there is some choices. So Docker image list, and that's the one that we got back. Cool. So that is the beginning of our application. So this is a really good start, but I want to improve on this. All right, so the first improvement I want to make here is I have this just random string that I'm using. Instead of using a string, I want to create an actual object that models our request. So I want to call this Chat GPT request. So I'm just going to create a new Java class here. I'm going to call this Chat GPT request. Now, instead of using a class, I'm going to use something called a record. If you're not familiar with what a record is, I will leave some information in the description below, but in short, a record allows us to write more concise code. It is an immutable class, so we're going to create an instance of this using the constructor, and then we can no longer change those variables later, right? So we're going to say this is a record. So this record is just going to represent what a request looks like. So it's going to contain a model, a prompt, a temperature, and a max token. So the way we represent this in a record here is we will say we need a string model, We need a string prompt. We need an integer for temperature. Oops, temperature. Sorry. And then we need an int for max tokens. So that's it. That's our record. We don't need any more code in here. We get a constructor that can go ahead and create this object. We get getters. We get a toString. We get a equals and hash code, all the good stuff right out of the box. So now what we can do is come back and remove this stuff. So we don't need this input anymore. And what we can do is say new Chat GPT request. So that's going to take in a model, and this is going to be text DaVinci 001. And then, is that right? Text DaVinci. That's right. 001. And then we'll pass in our search string. We will have a temperature of 1 and a max tokens of 100. And then we'll create a variable out of that called Chat GPT request. So now we've turned this random string into something that is more type friendly, right? We have a type for this, and it's called Chat GPT request. Now, to write this as a string to this, we need to do something, right? So how can I just write this as, say, like a JSON string so that my request can use this? To make this happen, we are going to bring in an external library. This is something called Jackson, which has Jackson data binding, which is for a lot of what we're going to do here today, which is kind of serializing, deserializing these objects from JSON to JSON. So we're going to create a new property in here. I'm going to say that this is the Jackson version that I'm going to use. And then I'm going to bring in 3 dependencies. And this is just kind of coming straight from the Jackson documentation. So if you want to go ahead and take a look at that, this will make a little bit more sense. So I'm bringing in Jackson core, the annotations, and the data binding. So once I have that in place, now I can do something here. I can go ahead and get an object mapper, which is from Jackson. So we could say new object. Oops, I don't think I've reloaded Maven. So let's do that. So once I do that, new object mapper, and we'll create a variable for that called object mapper. Once I have an object mapper, I can go ahead and create that input string. So I'm going to say string input is equal to mapper.write value as string. So this takes an object. So we're going to pass in our Chat GPT request. And now that is going to give us the JSON string that we need here. All right, now that we've done that for the request, I want to do the same for the response. We need to get some types back in the response. So I'm going to actually cut those 2 lines to get the status code in the body. And I just want to do something here. I want to say if the response.status code is equal to 200, then we have a good request, right? If it's 200, let's do something else. Just kind of print those out for me. I want to see what's going on for right now. If it's a 200, I want to use that object mapper. So I'm going to say mapper.read value. So this is going to read value. So it's going to read in something, and that is going to be the response.body. So what we can get from here, we actually don't have a type yet. What we can get from here is we can take that response and turn this into an object. So what I want to return this into is a Chat GPT response. So let's go ahead and create this. So we're going to say new Java class Chat GPT response. And I messed up. We want this to be a record. And so Chat GPT response is going to have some components. So again, what we're doing here is we are going to model this right after everything that came back in the response. I've already kind of done this, so I'm going to save us some time and just kind of paste these in here. And so what this gets back is we get that ID, an object, created, model. We have some choices, and we have the usage. So again, those were objects as well. So what I want to do is go ahead and create a Chat GPT response choice. We're going to create this in the same package, and this is going to be a record as well. Again, a record's really just kind of helping us cut down on some of the verbosity that we have to go ahead and type any of this stuff out in. So I'm going to say that, and now we have the text, index, log probes, finished reasons, and then we need one more, which is the Chat GPT response usage. And so let's create that, and we'll say add, and this is going to be a record, and this is just a couple of things, I think. Yep. So we'll go ahead and paste this in here. So that's prompt tokens, completion tokens, and total tokens. So again, this is just what we are getting back in this response. We are taking all of this response that we get here and basically turning them into records. So the main top level one is that Chat GPT response, which contains ID object, created, model, and then choices. Choices is another object that contains things like text, index, log probes, finished reasons. And then we also have this usage. So that is why I've kind of broken those down into different classes. So now that we have all of those out of the way, back in our code, we can basically read this into something called a Chat GPT response. So we can say we have a Chat GPT response here, and that is going to, that is the response body. The type is going to be a Chat GPT response.class. Okay, so that's how it knows what it needs to kind of create from that response. So now that we have the response, what we can do is we can get the actual response. So remember, in that array of choices, that last one may be like the ls, or the one example we looked at was like a Docker list. So we can say here is we need the answer, and the answer is going to be Chat GPT response dot choices. Remember, the choices is an array. So what I want to do is just get the last one. So I want to say Chat GPT response dot choices dot length -1. Again, we're just kind of guessing here that the last one's the best one. And then we're going to go ahead and get the text out of that. So that's our answer. And then we're going to just say if our answer is not empty, so is empty, I want you to do one thing. Just go ahead and print that out. And we're going to say answer.replace. Remember, there were a couple /lns in there. So I want to say, hey, if there's any of those new line characters, just go ahead and replace those and trim it up for me. So that could be our answer. So I think that's it. So now if we get our response back, we're going to create a ChatGPT response out of it. Now we have an object to work with. Now we could iterate over those choices if we wanted to, or in this case, we can just get the last one and print that out to the console. So let's see if everything we've done so far works. Let's go ahead and run this. And there we go. So we have ls. So you could probably even take this one step further and maybe use the clipboard and copy it to the clipboard. It's not always going to be the right answer. It's not always this easy command that you can just paste into a new terminal. So I decided not to keep that in the final source code, but that is something you could do if you're interested in. Okay, so we are making some pretty good progress on this application. One thing I want to point out here is we've hard-coded our token key, our secret key into our application. This is something we obviously don't want to do. So in the final source code, I think I'll go ahead and include it. Well, you can either pull this in using something like system.getProperty and create an environment variable, or I really like a project called .env, which allows you to just stick a .env in your source code, and then you can create like an open API key in there and then read it from there. I'm not going to go through that today. If you're interested in more on that, let me know, but it will be in the final source code if you want to take a look at that. What I want to do is go on and talk about building this application for the actual command line. I want to build a native image for this. To do so, I've noticed one little problem here is that I'm just automatically reading in what is coming in from the prompt here. This is okay for when we run the application and we open it up here in our console and we type in a prompt and we go out and call the API. But at the end of the day, what happens is when we run this from the command line, we're going to pass in a string that is our prompt, and that is going to be one of these arguments. So I want to handle both cases. And the way I'm going to do so is I'm going to create a variable here. Let's just call this prompt. And I'm going to say if args.length is greater than 0. So really, I just care if it's 1. If you're passing in a whole bunch of prompts, it doesn't really matter to me. But I want to get that first prompt. So I'm going to say the prompt is equal to args of 0. If it's not, if there are no prompts or if there are no arguments, then I want to go ahead and just prompt you. So what I'll say is the prompt is equal to scanner.nextLine. So now when I come down here and I create an object mapper and I create a Chat GPT request, I'm going to use that prompt. So that still looks like it's good. Now what I need to do is compile this as a native executable. So I've done some tutorials on GraalVM in the past. Go ahead and look for those on my channel. This isn't going to be an intro to GraalVM. This video is already kind of getting long, so I want to keep this a little bit concise here. And we're gonna fly through this a little bit. But here in my pom.xml, I want to use GraalVM and I want to use the GraalVM native Maven plugin. I actually have a live template for this, so I don't have to type this out. So I just type native Maven plugin, but you can copy this directly from the documentation for GraalVM's native Maven plugin. That's what I did. This will put me into an image name. So I can say my image name is WTF GPT. This is what I want the image name to be. So on my command line, this is what I'm going to type to get this to work. So then I need a main class. This is my main application class, which is dev.danvega.wtfgpt, as noted right here in this package. And that is it. I'm also referring to a specific version. So I'm going to have to go ahead and copy a version in here. So let's just go back up to our properties and we'll declare a version for 0.9.19, which at the time of this recording is the latest. Whew, so that was a lot. So now what we need to do to make this happen is we're going to have to build a native executable. Now, if you've done anything with GraalVM in the past, you probably already know what's going to happen, but for those of you who haven't, let's walk through this and talk about it. So we've created a new profile called native profile. So what happens from the command line, I can run maven clean. Actually, we haven't even, yeah, we have. So maven clean, we're going to switch to the profile native and we're going to compile this. So I'm doing this knowing very well that this is going to fail. And actually it will create a native executable for us, but it will go ahead and fail if we try to run it. The reason for this is because we are using something called Jackson underneath the hood. That is what does that kind of marshalling and unmarshalling of the objects to JSON and back and forth. And that project underneath the hood uses a lot of reflection. And reflection is a way to basically make Java dynamic. So you get to do things at runtime. So I won't go into it. I've done a video on this, why you need to look out for dynamic language features in Java when you're working with GraalVM and what to do about them. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you need to provide some metadata to your application to say, these are the things that are unreachable at compile time or when you're building that you didn't see. So what it's not seeing is all these, records that we created because we're not getting to the application doesn't see every single path. So we're going to need to provide some metadata, but I'll just show you if we go ahead and try to run the WTF GPT program and we enter a string, hello, you'll see that we get this no serializer found for Chat GPT request. Again, it even says it in here. This appears to be a native image, in which case you may need to configure reflection for the class that is to be serialized. All right, so if you look at the README in the repository for the source code that we're going through right now, there is a string that you can provide to GraalVM to enable the tracing agent. And that's what we need to do here. So I'm going to go up to edit my run configuration. I'm going to need a VM option here. And in this VM option, I am just going to enable the tracing agent, and I'm going to enable the config output to go to source main resources, meta-inf, nata image. So what happens now is if we run this application and do a quick search, what is the directory? What is the directory to list all files? Wait, nope. What is the command to list all files in a directory on a Mac? Okay, and so what's going to happen is after that ran, you'll see in source main resources meta-inf native image, there is a bunch of files, one of which is this reflect config. And this will go through and find out all of the different paths that your application may take. So you can see we get this Chat GPT request. Here's some methods on it. Here's the Chat GPT response. Here's a method on it. This is where things get a little screwed up because you don't see the methods on the Chat GPT response for all of the components of that record. So at this point, I talked about this in a previous video. This is where you'll kind of need to do some finagling. All I'm going to do though is if you go ahead and use the, if you go ahead and look at the final source code on the repository, that will include all of these objects that you need. So I'm going to just copy the ones that I need here, which is right up to here. And I think if we do this correctly and I paste this in, that has our response usage and our choices and our response and our request. So that should be it. Again, you can just copy this from the repository. You don't need to type this out. Once you have this, we should be able to build a native executable now. So again, we're going to come back into here. We're going to run that same command that we did before. So once that's done, let's go ahead and try to run our native executable. So we'll go to target, WTF GPT. And now what I want to do is pass in my request, right? I'm going to pass in my prompt because it's an argument to the application now. So I'll say, what is the command to list all files in a directory on Mac OS? In the terminal, use the command ls followed by the name of the directory. So that was the response from Chat GPT. So awesome. We have a native executable. What we can do with this now is just create an alias to it. Okay, so I use Z shell. So I'm here in my ZSHRC. So I want to create an alias for this. So I have an alias called WTF GPT. And what I want to do is go ahead and point this to users/Vega/downloads. This is in the downloads folder. I have something called WTF GPT, and this is in the target directory, and this is WTF GPT. I believe that's the case. Let's just go ahead and double check this. WTF-GPT. So WTF-GPT, target, so download, target, and then WTF GPT. So that should work. So let's go ahead and close this. I'm going to go ahead and restart terminal here. So I'm going to type WTF GPT and pass in the command. What is the command to list all Docker images? And it will go off and ask GPT for this and return back the command Docker images. Hey, and there you have it, WTF GPT. I thought this was a really fun project to work on. It combined a lot of things that are interesting to a lot of people, including myself. First off, we started with just building a normal Java application from the command line, which incorporated a lot of different things, right? Like we had to read in some text. We had to maybe see if there was an argument that was being passed in. We had to create a request. We did that using just a normal search string at first. Then we brought in the Jackson library that helps us with kind of creating those objects from JSON or creating them to JSON. We took a look at the HTTP client that came in Java 11. So just a whole bunch of things to build what I think is a really practical example that we could use. I could see myself using this application. Thanks to GraalVM, we were able to create a native executable, alias it on our machine. And now, right from the command line, I can always just say WTF GPT and get a response back. This will be helpful when I can't remember a command to do something and I'm on the command line and I don't want to switch over to the browser, because constantly context switching is not good for staying focused on a certain task. So again, the source code for this is in the description below. If you have any questions on it, please feel free to leave those below. If you want to improve on this, if you think there's things that we can add to this, do me a favor and leave an issue in the GitHub repository. So with that, I think that's where we'll close it today, friends. Do me a big favor, though. Hey, if you found some value in this, I like those thumbs up. Please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.